Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today, Zoom In, Zoom Out on Compliance. My name is Kayla Martins, and I'm manager of RELA's Retail Compliance Center. I will get us started today with a couple housekeeping items and help moderate our Q&A later on. I'm also joined by Kevin Gibney from RELA, who will also be helping to run the show. Next slide. So everyone is muted upon entry. This does reduce background noise during the presentations. We will be recording this presentation today. It will not include the Q&A, but it will be housed on RELA's RCC site for future views. We will send out the recording and the slides shortly after this webinar. If you do have any questions and comments, please use the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen right below the presentation. And those will go directly to the panelists and moderators, and we'll answer those after the conclusion of the presentation today. Next slide. I do also want to read off RELA's antitrust statement today. This may or may not be a concern during this webinar or during the Q&A, but it's always good to keep in mind. So I want to remind everyone about the importance of antitrust compliance. Our goal is to avoid even the appearance of impropriety, so please avoid any discussion of prices, pricing policies, terms or conditions of doing business, or of course, any sort of market allocation. Also to be avoided is any discussion that might be perceived as suggesting that anyone should cease doing business with a particular supplier or customer, or any other discussion that might be viewed as coercive or exclusionary toward another company. If anyone feels uncomfortable about any subject or discussion or has any questions, please speak up and we will pause the conversation until we can provide legal guidance. Next slide. This goes a little bit into antitrust, but also wanted to mention that this presentation is provided for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal, financial, or other professional advice. In addition, this presentation does not purport to be all-inclusive or to contain all the information that may be required. The Retail Compliance Center prohibits both the copying and redistribution of this presentation, or whole or in part, without the written permission of the Retail Compliance Center. Next slide. All right, so I am happy to introduce our speakers today, starting with Tiffin Shumake. Tiffin Shumake is RELA's Vice President and the Executive Director of RELA's Retail Compliance Center, a leading resource for environmental compliance and sustainability in the retail industry. Tiffin has over 25 years of experience focused on environmental compliance and sustainability. This includes supporting the federal government in environmental management systems, implementation, sustainable operations, small business compliance, and hazardous waste site allocation. Tiffin also managed an international technical exchange program for wastewater engineers in Central Europe and a nonprofit focused on improving results for state environmental agencies. Tiffin has a Bachelor of Science degree in biology from Syracuse University and a Master of Science degree in information systems from George Mason University. We'll also hear today from Perry and John Storlie. Pat Perry is an environmental professional with over 30 years of experience. She recently joined Tractor Supply Company to lead its environmental strategy and compliance program. In this capacity, she is responsible for developing and implementing environmental policies and strategies that ensure stores, distribution centers, and corporate facilities are compliant with state and federal environmental laws and regulations. Prior to joining Tractor Supply Company, Pat managed her own consulting firm where she leveraged her years of retail corporate experience to help retailers with environmental compliance and creating organizational structures to support programming. Over the past few years, Pat, in partnership with John Storlie, has developed and presented both workshops and webinars of the Retail Compliance Center. Lastly, John Storlie will be joining us. He is Principal Consultant Managing Member at the OS Group, which provides environmental compliance and compliance management consulting services. John Storlie has extensive knowledge, experience, and expertise across a wide range of environmental consulting arenas, including compliance and permitting, industrial hygiene, health and safety, contaminant investigations and remediation, and natural resources. John has managed more than 1,800 active remediation, due diligence, natural resources, and compliance projects, including multi-state, multi-site projects for national accounts. In a prior position, John was responsible for national account management for national retail clients. He provided account management oversight and project management mentoring. He served in program management and senior technical consultant roles for retail clients, with expertise in compliance programs for retail and logistics operation and the electronics collection and recycling programs. So we have quite the lineup today, and I'm very excited to pass it over to our speakers today to get us started.
There. Thank you, Kayla. I think we'll start with a question for the audience to set the stage for today's topics. Do you feel comfortable that your compliance programs are in good shape? Choose the answer that best fits your situation. Feel you're absolutely in good shape, pretty comfortable, you're not too sure, you're somewhat comfortable that your programs are in good shape, or ugh. Don't even ask. All right, that's about what you expect. A good chunk are very, very comfortable with their program. Most are pretty comfortable. A few are not too sure. Some are somewhat uncomfortable. And that's nice to see that no one feels that, ugh, they're completely at a loss. All right, thanks, Kevin. Next slide, please. There we go. Close that out. All right, zoom in, zoom out on compliance. What are we talking about? The whole idea of zoom in, zoom out is just a way to examine a compliance program or any kind of program or process. It's a method of putting the lens on a process by asking yourself and your team broad probing questions and then zooming in on the details, zooming back out, zooming back in where necessary. Now, each of us has a tendency to lean on one or the other, that is to get lost in the details or to make broad sweeping overgeneralizations. Zooming in and zooming out through a few iterations helps to keep you from missing the little details that can be so important in compliance, and if missed can get you into trouble. It also helps you to avoid not seeing the forest through the trees. These are both traps that different people can fall into at different times and in different situations. For today's discussion, Zoom In is all about the day-to-day basics of getting compliance done. It's the tactical and logistical aspects of maintaining known compliance obligations. We think this is worth taking a few minutes to think about the administrivia of our jobs and compliance programs and how it's been complicated in this crazy year of the pandemic, when so many of you in the EHS field are swamped with extra duties and COVID-related crises of the day. And overall, it's important to take a time out, to huddle up with the team and assess if the little things are getting done. In the Zoom In segment, we will talk about processes you probably already have in place, but which may have suffered in 2020 for any number of reasons. It's meant to help you refocus on day-to-day activities now that the initial demands of responding to COVID-19 have turned into an ongoing slog. The zoom out segment, on the other hand, will be that step back, as we said before, to view the big picture of compliance, evaluating the strategy. Are you making progress to your goals? Have you identified all the compliance programs and activities your operations are required to have? Now, this is where the retail advisor on the RCC can really help provide insights into gaps in compliance programming and provide valuable benchmarking data to help you understand how you compare to your peers. Tiffin will walk us through the retail advisor and some of the tools that she has, that the RELA has there, and explain their benefits that they have to offer us. Then we'll come back and talk about the basics of an EMS and other tools on the RCC website to help you with compliance. Let's get started. Next slide, please. All right, another polling question. In the past 2 or 3 months, have you seen an increase in agency inspections at your stores compared to the first half of the year? Yeah, about 50-50, a little more yes than than no. I actually would have expected to see a little more. In my practice, my clients are seeing many more inspections. I think that some of the agencies are having to step it up in the last half of the year to meet their MOU, their memorandums of agreement with the US EPA. And if you aren't seeing it, I suspect you will be. Next slide, please. Let's get started by refocusing the lens on basic compliance now that dealing with the COVID-19 crisis has become more routine. Inspectors are back in the field, and for some folks, you might say that's with a vengeance. So let's make sure your team is prepared and set up for success in 2021. Topics covered in this segment are the tactical components of compliance around air, water, and waste. Before we get started with that, we'll talk about resources and logistics of getting things done in this new world that we work in. All right, next slide, please. The logistics. 2020 and the response to COVID-19 has created new challenges that need to be factored in as you plan out the logistics of completing your compliance activities. Many of you may have already overcome these obstacles, but some good things to think about and chat about. For instance, you should know where the resources are that you need to lean on and how to take into account the constraints they may face, those other people may face. For instance, how far in advance do you need to plan to request checks for vendors or agencies when they may only be cut on certain days of the week because key people are only in the office certain days of the week? Is the snail mail getting to you promptly or even at all? Were there losses in the mailroom because of the pandemic and everyone working from home? Can you get your renewals notices to you promptly? And in turn, can you get them out along with fee invoices promptly? Is there a way for you to go to the agency and request getting those notices and invoices sent to you electronically instead of having to suffer with the snail mail? The pandemic has certainly complicated getting some of the simplest things done. Another thing to plan for would be knowing where the potential log jams are. By identifying them, can you avoid delays and missed deadlines? If people are working remotely, do they have access to printers, scanners, and mail? All these little things you didn't need to think about when everyone was in the office. Lastly, who needs to sign what and how will their signatures be obtained? Do those folks have e-signature capabilities? Yet not all states accept e-signatures. Some still want wet signatures on permit applications and annual reports. What's your plan if that's the case? Typically, getting a signature is one of the last steps in the process. Knowing in advance what signature format is acceptable can save you a lot of last-minute stress. Then there's the whole step of merging that wet signature copy with the check and getting it in the mail on time. And this Postal Service has been much slower these days in some areas. Can you put any processes in place to make this more routine and not require any or much active shepherding by your team? We've seen that that's sucking up a lot of staff resource time. Now, these are really basic considerations, and no doubt most of you have already dealt with them. But when so many employees are working remotely, sometimes completing the simplest task is a challenge. Our final words of advice on the logistics side of getting things done is plan, plan, plan. With the next slide, I pass the baton back to Pat.
Okay, thank you, John, and hello, everyone. So let's talk about compliance in that general sense. So, one thing that makes our jobs just a little bit easier is that compliance programs typically have common program elements or tasks. So things like, they need a permit or there's a registration, routine inspections, annual reports, record keeping, things of those natures. So I'm sure that, many of you have Excel spreadsheets, maybe other types of systems that provide alerts to you as to when, permits need to be renewed, or there's some other filing, requirement that's needed. So those tools are really helpful to keep you focused and, on upcoming tasks, and also help you plan your workload a little bit. So if you don't have some type of tracking mechanism, now is a great time to get one. Believe me, it's worth the time spent in putting that together. So as you prepare for annual filings, either at the end of this year or Q1 of 2021, it's an ideal time to check in with facilities or your operation leaders. Check to see if there have been any operational changes or new equipment brought in over the past year. So for many retailers, big equipment changes typically only happen at distribution centers. However, depending on the type of operation you are, right? So retailers with grocery operations, they may have had upgrades to refrigeration units or maybe bakery ovens. My experience has been that, sometimes changes don't always get communicated up to the corporate compliance team at headquarters. But, if you ask the question, light bulbs go off and information usually ends up coming in, right? So an annual check-in with operation partners and is always a good idea to ensure that you're meeting your compliance obligations, or where you might have a little bit of work to do in 2021 or at the end of the year. Okay, next slide, please. Kevin or Kayla, can you advance to the next slide?
I'm not sure if, Kevin, if you can hear me, I'm not sure if the slide deck is moving.
Are we stuck?
There we go.
There we go. All right, great. Okay, so, likewise, it's a really good idea to take a look at your program training, right? It's another one of those opportunities to zoom in and zoom out that John talked about earlier. So take a look at your modules and look at the content that's within each. Ask yourself, have there been any operational changes that might require a tweak to your training modules? Also, I think it's a really good time to kind of take a look at the content and, is it clear, right? Is it clear for those at the store level? Do they understand what you're saying? Are there opportunities, right, to make some improvements to your training documents? Also along those training lines, think about pulling reports, right, to understand what the completion rates are looking at, especially at the store level. So as you all know, if you have that there is an annual training requirement for locations that are LQG, it's a good time to check to see if there are any gaps, and then to take action. Okay, annual renewals and annual reports, right? That should be like hitting your radar right about now. And so in preparation, right, for those reports, do you know what the due dates are, right? Do you have a plan for meeting those due dates? Where is the data that you're going to need, such as your waste data or maybe your recycling weights to give to your sustainability people? right? So who are the partners that you're going to need to work with, both internally and then your vendors too, right? To make sure you can get the information out of their systems that you really need. And along those lines, like make sure that there's a process in place to ensure that the data that you're getting has been reviewed and validated. Nothing's worse, right, than at the last minute you find out that corrections need to be made and you're bumping up the deadline. So like John said, it really all goes back to planning, right? Okay, so at the same time, right now with your compliance program, there's really a great opportunity for another like zoom in, zoom out view, right? Where you look at your environmental program as a whole, right? And review environmental regulations against your programming. So, it's suggested in many of the EMS guidances that you take a look at your programming every 3 years. So is it time to take a look to see if any changes have occurred, within your operations, within regulations that may be applicable to your company now that weren't in the past? We're going to talk more about this in the Zoom Out segment, especially when, how you can leverage the retail advisor to help you. And then John and I are going to talk about how you can use just the basic concept of EMS to help you really go through that process of taking that big picture look.
Hey, Pat, can I share a comment on the training?
Sure.
As you were speaking, I thought about if you're tracking any enforcement activity out at the stores, inspections and violations, if you do any root cause analysis, it might bring you back to reviewing that, circling back to your training. And that would be a good time to do those analyses. A lot of times the inspectors will give you what I call dog pile violations. And one of them is always, well, if you're not executing, you must have inadequate training. So they pile on inadequate training as an additional violation. And I call it a dog pile violation. But in a way, it is a good place to go back and look in your root cause analysis.
Yeah, I agree. And I will just add to your comment, John, is that, it's a good time to review the training of the stores to know where to get like the training documents to give to the regulators. Because, many times training at the store level has been completed, but, whoever's helping out with the inspection doesn't know how to pull those records down. So, that's a good, a good practice as well is, make sure your folks in the store know where to get these training records, because my experience is they're there, they just don't know how to get them or, whatever. But, okay, so with that, and thank you for the comment, John, we're going to talk about just a few more, talk about specific programs, right? And so I'm going to turn it over to John, who's going to kick us off with talking about our favorite topic, hazardous waste. You're on, John.
Thanks, Pat. Absolutely. Hazardous waste management probably represents one of the largest compliance risks for retailers, and probably, and almost certainly, the largest part of your compliance workload. Now, whether your stores are VSQG or LQG, it requires constant care and feeding to look for opportunities to reduce generator status and monitor for controlling costs, much less just maintaining the bare basics of minimum compliance. With COVID, some of us may have taken our eye off this ball or haven't had time to deal with it properly. And now year end is a good time to get back on track. Excuse me. One good way is to analyze inspection and assessment data to identify opportunities for program enhancements, and also identify where to focus your energy for improved compliance. Perhaps this is identifying a business unit or district or geographic area that's falling down a little bit and needs some extra support. Or maybe it's a particular program. This effort can help you with goal setting for 2021 and associated planning. Now, Pat talked about looking at data for year-end reporting. You should also assess your waste data to review generator status. Do you need to increase the status to stay compliant? Or conversely, if you have any facilities that are LQGs, can you bump them down to SQG? Changing generator status from LQG to SQG reduces the hassle of maintaining many onerous obligations like training and contingency plans and quarterly waste pickups. You can save time, hassle, and money. Likewise, a move from SQG to VSQG further reduces obligations. And in most jurisdictions, VSQG waste pickups can be reduced to annually from 180 days at SQG. As a VSQG, you have much greater flexibility on figuring out what works best for your company. Maybe you set those pickups at every 9 months to make sure you're compliant, but you save a big chunk of change over 6-month frequencies. And then, of course, some states require annual reporting for SQGs, but not at all for very small quantity generators. You should prepare for waste reporting at the state level by understanding what needs to be reported, just like you need to know what waste streams are counted for determining generator status. Typically, reporting focuses on RCRA waste and state-regulated waste, hazardous waste, excluding universal waste, but not always. Now's a good time to review the data from your waste hauler or whatever the source is for outliers that may be obvious errors, such as extremely large waste pickup weights or anomalous waste codes. For instance, if your stores don't have a pharmacy or sell smoking cessation products, you should probably not see P-listed waste codes in your data. Unless you're in manufacturing, you probably shouldn't be seeing F-listed or K-listed codes in your data set. It does sound silly, but errors happen, and now's the best time to get them fixed, corrected, before you're in that cram next quarter, doing all that reporting that needs to be done by March 1st. Pass it back to Pat on the next slide.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Tier 2 reporting. Most of you, I'm sure, have been through the mad rush associated with filing a Tier 2 report and getting everything done by the March 1st deadline. It's always quite the challenge. So I think it's going to be really challenging this year because of office restrictions, right, due to COVID. That's going to take this process and probably complicate it a little bit more. So when it comes to, planning, just like John said, plan. I think it's really, really important, and plan early too. So just some things to keep in mind, start with confirming your chemical inventories by reporting location. Make sure that if you have any changes, they're noted, and you're prepared to enter them into the systems. Actually the multiple systems that you need to work with, and you've gotten all your usernames and your passcodes all together, so you're ready to go. Get updated contact information. Over a year, a lot of people can change, things can change. So make sure that you've got the most up-to-date contact information. Likewise, make sure that you know that the state hasn't changed in some way the reporting system that they're using. So get on top of it now, so that you're prepared for for the season. Research agencies that need a copy of the Tier 2 report, like LEPC is your fire department. Make sure you know the format that they want the information in. Some still want hard copies. Others will accept an email with a file on it. Make sure you have the correct mailing addresses so that, a couple of weeks later, you're not getting that report back that it's undeliverable. So just small things like that. And then when it comes to, I kind of alluded to this earlier, the whole state system situation, right? Make sure you know what you're dealing with, because there is a learning curve associated with working with those systems. as you probably know, Tier 2 reporting in Texas goes through the STEER system, right? I mean, that system has its challenges, right? As far as, getting certain permits and access and things like that. So get ready now so that you're not like up against the wall at the last minute. Likewise, make sure that you understand any changes the state may have, especially like around signatures or, corporate office required signatures to either do a registration or to actually kind of close out and file your permit. So really try to plan early. Likewise, when it comes to maps for your reporting facilities, make sure that they're current and up to date, especially if you've added a new chemical inventory, you may need to make a change to the map. So lastly, and probably many of you know this if you've been down this road before, but states like Delaware and Vermont and Louisiana have a lower reporting threshold for hazardous substances, and that's 500 pounds. So this lower threshold may trigger reporting for facilities that you may not have necessarily associated with Tier 2 reporting. So just a heads up there. So with that, I'll turn it back over to John. So we'll have the next slide and we'll talk about stormwater.
Thank you, Pat.
Welcome, John.
At your distribution and transportation facilities, you probably have no exposure certifications or NECs. You might have general permits and maybe even individual permits. Mostly you probably have NECs. No exposure certificates are typically a 5-year deal, but not always. In some states, it's just a self-certification that you merely keep on site. In others, you have to submit and get approval for your no exposure application. Texas, for example, has a short 2-year period for renewal. Whatever the period for renewal or the process, submittal or self-certification, as a best practice, it's a really good idea to do an annual review of your compliance with the conditions of no exposure. Send out a checklist to remind facility what it means to have an NEC and to make sure they're continuing to meet the conditions of no exposure. Remember, whoever signed that no exposure certificate, whether it was submitted to an agency or it's just kept on site for inspection purposes, available for an inspector, it was probably signed by the general manager of the facility or their boss. It has to be someone with P&L responsibility over the facility. And they have promised that they're self-certified. They've promised that they're going to meet those conditions of no exposure. And logistics operations tend to push the envelope on what they're storing outside. So if you can do it, if you have an LP or a safety person supporting you or an EH&S person with regional authority or field work, field activity over distribution centers, ask them to do a walkover. Is the facility still meeting all those conditions of the company's no exposure certification? Anything that would expose the runoff, the rainwater, the snow melt, that would expose it to pollutants. As I said, it's a self-certification. Open top dumpsters and roll-offs with waste or scrap metal and outdoor storage of racking are some of the most common things DCs will start to push the envelope on. Another thing that I've commonly seen is big stains coming out of the compactors, the solid waste compactors, especially at grocery distribution centers, if they have frozen food, ice cream, or produce that might end up in there. And you just get a lot of liquids and staining. An inspector would see that as a violation. And if you have a violation or you're not meeting those certification, it could pull you into a general permit, which might mean sampling and monitoring, much heavier reporting. In some cases, annual reporting of stormwater monitoring is required under individual or general permits. We noticed recently that New York State is now requiring electronic submittal of monitoring data. And again, Texas, the TCEQ Reporting uses the STIR system, and it, again, as Pat mentioned, requires a lot to set up an account and to add users. And it takes a fair amount of time, especially if your corporate headquarters or the user is out of state. If you don't have an account set up with Texas in the STIRS program, you want to look at that sooner rather than later. Also remember those locations where last year you had to do local or municipal stormwater renewals and reporting. This is common in places like South Florida in particular. Are you queued up for this year? Be a good idea to think about it now, collecting the data from your vendors or your operations team or your facility maintenance team. Next slide, please, Kevin. Thank you. Spill prevention, control, and countermeasure. A complete documented review and evaluation of SPCC plans is required by federal law once every 5 years, but an annual review is a best practice. Now, the 5-year review and evaluation must include technical amendments, which are required when there are changes to facility itself, the building, the footprint, the operational process flows, to tanks that store oils or oil storing equipment, or the oil storage areas have been moved or expanded. Technical amendments require certification by a professional engineer unless you self-certify. Administrative amendments are required when there are changes in personnel or business entity names. You get bought out or you're restructured under a holding company or whatever might happen. You need to track that as an administrative change. And each of those amendments need to be documented and kept with the plan for the life of the plan, and a minimum of 3 years. As an annual best practice, you really should review all of the above every year, plus incidents. Have there been any spills, and did the procedures work as expected? Are enhancement to your procedures or to the plans called for? Was the post-incident review documented in the plan? You have to do that if you have a spill incident. If it's a small spill, that can be relatively easy to do. If it's a large spill that gets into the waterways, it's a more complicated review and documentation. Training. Is the annual training getting done? Now, under SPCC, this can be very informal training, but at the same time, it must be documented. So a few slides in a deck, or even an outlined set of notes for an informal team huddle, and a sign-in sheet kept in the plan, the hard copy of the plan, is a good way to document it. Inspections. Are the inspections of the tanks and the oil storage equipment getting done and documented per the plan schedule? Remember, the SPCC rules require 3 years of record keeping. And back to Pat for the next slide.
Okay, thank you, John. Okay, let's talk about impacts and potential opportunities, right? That some of the new hazardous waste rules and regulation changes may present for retailers. You know, although the adoption of the generator improvement rule is still happening, right? Many states have gone through that process. The CRC website has a really nice map that shows the status of the gen rule and its adoption. Yeah, I think there is a lot of opportunity there. I think there's opportunities to understand where states have adopted the rule, and then what parts they probably more importantly haven't adopted, right? So that you can understand that. It seems like episodic generation is one of those little points of the gen rule that seems to be either in or out. So understanding locations, I did notice that a couple of states have out recently emails regarding SQG renotification, right? That's going to happen in 2020. So I think it was Michigan and Wisconsin that I noticed sent out emails last week stating that requirements under the improvement rule are due by September 1st of 2021. And in Wisconsin, if you submit an annual report there that's due on March 1st, that will also qualify as your re-notification. So I do think it's worth understanding where states are accepting other notification sources. It may save you some time and energy. The aerosol universal waste rule in subpart P, they're also in that adoption process, right, by states. And again, the CRC website has good information for you for both of those. And each of them really do merit review and understanding, of what these regulations may offer your company, right, in terms of reducing, the overall compliance burden, which often translates into reduced labor at store level and also, reduced expense, right? So it really is a good idea to kind of, and this is a great time of the year to do it, is to step back, zoom out, take a look at these rules where you need to zoom in and understand what benefits they may have to offer you. So with that, let's go to the next slide, Kevin. And now we really do want to zoom out, right? Really take that big step backwards. We kind of drilled into a lot of details. Now it's like, let's look at your overall program, like we were talking about earlier in the presentation. So, this is the part where you start asking yourself, have I hit my metrics? Am I moving the needle? Am I making a difference in compliance? And, this is zooming out. Is really where you take that hard, comprehensive look at your program. And this is also where the retail advisor can really help you. So, personally, in my new role at Tractor Supply, I fully plan to engage in the advisor. Some of what I've tinkered with so far, has really, I think will help me make sure that I can chart out a good path to ensure compliance obligations are covered. The report outputs look really great. And also, the information to help me understand how Tractor Supply compares with peers, I think will also be beneficial. So we're gonna start this segment out with Tiffin describing the retail advisor, helping you understand how the tool works and the benefits. And then John and I will kind of jump back in and go through ways to help close the identified gaps that either come from using the advisor or just going through your program review, and how you can use the basic EMS strategy to help you systematically go through your compliance obligations. And then we'll also go through some tools, other tools that are on and available through the CRC website that can help you go through that process, right? So you're not out there alone. There's a lot of really good resources that are available through the CRC. So with that, let me turn it over to Tiffin to walk through the retail advisor.
Okay, thank you, Pat. So the advisor is a tool to help retailers design and implement more effective compliance programs. And there are many tools out there around environmental compliance, but we wanted one that would help reflect some of the challenges that you have in retail. I mean, it's hundreds to even thousands of facilities. The regulations vary by jurisdiction. Some are not really designed for retail, particularly hazardous waste. And also the reality that the person implementing the program at the store is not an EH&S expert, but it's your 20-something clerk. So we wanted to design a program to help retailers optimize their program, make sure it was the right fit for them, and also possibly even use their program to reduce their risk and their compliance obligations. So it's based on an interactive platform that we use. The best part about the advisor is that it is free for retailers, and you don't have to be a RELA member. It's all retailers. And we have similar advisors for energy management programs, diversity and inclusion, and we're developing one now for sustainability. So next slide, please. Oh, we have a poll question that I had forgotten about. Okay, so this poll question is really looking at your environmental management system, whether or not you use an EMS or not. So if you could go ahead and fill that out. And really, as you're looking at that, one reason that we wanted to include this is the thought that to get the benefits of an EMS or all the development, the work over the years that's gone into EMS, you don't have to have a certified EMS or even one that really closely follows, but taking a look at the elements of an EMS can be very helpful in thinking about what your program should have, or where you might want to add additional aspects to your program. So that's interesting, looking at the programs that have a certified EMS, and one of the benefits to that is that because you have to recertify it, there's internal support for the program. It's easier to say, yes, we need to continue having this program. And for those of you that haven't used the EMS, after I talk about the advisor, either Pat or John are going to talk more about the EMS, and we also have lots of good information on how an EMS can fit in with a retail program. Okay, so next slide. So the advisor is based on the compliance leadership model. And this is a model that we developed for a compliance program specifically for retail. And if you look at the dimensions on the side, if you're familiar with the EMS, those will look pretty familiar. And for each dimension, there's a number of rows under it that outline the parts of the program. And then across, there's 4 program elements. You look the essential to proactive. And as the programs move from that essential level, which is a basic program that's just focused on compliance, the programs become more structured, more universal through the organization, a little more focus on improving environmental performance, and also reducing risk, using data to not just improve compliance, but maybe reduce obligations. What's important about the compliance leadership model is that not every program needs to be at the proactive level. It really depends on the regulatory obligations, the level of risk, the corporate culture, on where the program should be. But everyone should be at least at the essential level. And when we designed the advisor, we assumed that you're at the essential level. We don't want to document that anyone's not there. But if there are questions about that, we do have a gap analysis document to look back at your program and see any place where it might be below that essential level. And you would definitely want to get it up there. But when you think about it, if you, let's say you have a grocery store with a gas station, there's a lot more regulatory obligations and risks. There's the risk of, if you had a spill and contaminated soil or groundwater, a lot more cost. You want to be moving into the structured or optimized program. If you have a clothing store in a mall with maybe perfume as your only item that could be considered a hazardous waste, you're probably good with an essential program, or maybe in a structured program, because you just don't have that many obligations, and it would be not cost effective to try to get into the optimized level. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So this is an overview of how the advisor works. So we have a platform, and the retailer takes an assessment based on that model that we just looked at. In addition to the model, we have questions related to program characteristics to help with benchmarking. And we just recently added more about programs like the number of staff, the budgets, the scope of the programs to help with benchmarking. So once you take the assessment and you're placed, and that places you on the model for your whole program and also for each of the different levels, each of the different rows and the dimensions, you get custom guidance. And the guidance could be places where you have additional risk. Maybe you have an essential level program, but additional hazardous waste issues, you might want to consider moving your program up. It also includes guidance on how to move your program to a different level, if that would make sense. The interactive results, you can drill down the whole assessment or drill down into the different levels. Peer benchmarking, you can compare where your program is to your peers, to all retailers or peers based on the compliance risk. So for example, standalone stores with gas or grocery, or stores in a mall. And then there's also the reporting. The reporting helps with communicating internally about this is where a program is. You look at your peers, your risks, and say, this is where I want my program to be. Goal setting and back, sort of that continuous improvement to periodically take the assessment to see where your program is. The advisor, it's based on the program. So we're not looking at data. You wouldn't be entering actual data like about inspections or violations, things like that. It's more, do you have the processes in place? All the data that you put in, it's completely confidential. We don't even have access to the information. The only information I can see is if someone has an assessment that they've done, and we can see aggregated results for all the folks who've done assessments, but we don't see the individual information. So just a quick recap on the advisor. It's for retailers. It's for all retailers. It's free. It involves that program evaluation and benchmarking, helps you optimize your program for your operations. And also it can help you in communicating what your program does and does not do. If you've used the advisor before, we just added those additional questions about the types of programs, the staffing and budget. So we'd be happy to schedule any time with you or your team if you want to walk through the advisor, see how it might work for you. At our very last slide, we have links to all the different resources for getting signed up or using the advisor, and also underlying resources and information. And then, as just a quick reminder, we have advisors for energy management and diversity and inclusion. And then we're working on the one for sustainability. So sort of getting into the E&S of the ESG, which is, I think, an approach you'll be hearing a lot more about. So with that, I will turn this back over to either Pat or John, not sure which. And you can go and move to the next slide.
Thanks, Tiffin. So once you use the retail advisor to give you insight on your program needs, how do you go about closing gaps or creating new programs? Oh, that's, no discussion of program management is complete without touching on EMS. And EMS is that tool for going about closing your gaps and creating new programs. Following the basic environmental management system formula is a practical approach to compliance, and it builds on a continuous improvement model. So whether you're following the US EPA guidance, ISO 14001, or the retail specific EMS guidance found on the RCC website, it all boils down to 4 simple words: plan, do, check, and act. Next slide, please. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the basic PDCA model. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it, but rather talk about EMSs, and they can be very detailed and require a lot of resources to manage, both internally and through outside certifications and outside audits, or they can be modified to tailor your needs. And a few years ago, Tiffin and I developed a retail specific model based on ISO 14001 and the EPA guidance. And it tries to boil it down into the essentials for retail. And that's available, again, for free on the RCC website. I encourage you to take a look at that and use it, or pick and choose the parts of it that you think will be helpful to you. So even if you don't have a formal EMS or plan on creating one, it truly can be a useful tool to help you perform a compliance gap assessment. Quiet, honey.
And while John manages his staff, I
have a little 3-year-old helper.
I can just add a couple of comments here, John. So, the whole idea of having an environmental management system, a lot of people, when they hear the word system, they think it's an electronic system, and it really isn't, right? It's a system where you systematically look at your compliance obligations. And the plan, do, check model is really a nice way to do that. The retail advisor also is another way to do that. But, I think it's really important that retailers, especially if you're in the process where, you have gaps places and you need to build out that program, and you may be afraid, maybe, regulators are breathing down your back or whatever, having a written documented EMS, I think, is valuable. in the sense that, it could be presented to the regulator. Yes, we know we have obligations. Yes, we're going through this process. Yes, it really helps to document that, your commitment, right, to environmental compliance. So I really do think that having that document and going through that process, I mean, there were a fair number of people in that poll that really, aren't following any type of guidance, or, maybe, and consequently, I suspect you don't have an environmental management, system in place. So you might want to give that some thought. And it really is a great roadmap, right, for what you need to get done and how you need to get it done, right? So with that, I'll turn it back to John.
Thank you, Pat. And a great point. And before my granddaughter came in to help, I was saying that even if you don't, and I think it's a very valuable tool to have in EMS, but even if you don't want to have that formal EMS system, it's a very helpful tool to help you answer those nagging questions about what aren't we covering, what don't I know that I should know. And again, the RCC website offers the free EMS guidance module, set of modules tailored to retail. And I think that was another great point to emphasize. It is not necessarily an information management system. I think that the two can be melded together very successfully, but they're two different things. An environmental management information system is an IT solution, and EMS is a process continuous improvement solution. Next slide, please. All right, here's just some resources and links for you to access when you get the deck. And you should get an email with a link to the deck in a day or two. Next slide, please. All right. Kayla, do we have any questions from the audience?
I do have one. We are coming up to the end of time. This is scheduled for 3 to 4, so I'll schedule in one question for Tiffin. And while we're doing that, we will launch a survey poll for this webinar. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out, and then if you have any questions, please feel free to add those in the chat box, the Q&A. If we don't get to those today, we'll make sure we can get those over to the speakers and get those answered. So this question is for Tiffin. Someone asked who or is someone available to walk through the advisor? What's the best way to get started?
So yes, someone can walk through the advisor with you, and the best way would be to email me. And I'm not sure if I put the email on the last slide. I don't think I did, but to email me and we can set up a time, do a Zoom and go through it. So if you don't have my email, it's on the website, or I think it's pretty easy to get. Kevin or Kayla, is it, or can you get Kevin include it on when you send out the slides?
Yeah, absolutely. Give it a couple minutes to see if any other questions came in. Are there any final comments from Pat, John, or Tiffin that you wanted to just put out there before we conclude?
I would just say I encourage everyone to look at the advisor and to think about using it, or if you haven't used it recently, to update your information so that we get that additional peer benchmarking information on programs. And we'll be probably not until the first of the year really pushing to get survey results by a certain time. So you'll certainly hear from us probably in the first of the year.
And I think I would just, close with that whole concept that we talked about of planning. And I do think that COVID is going to cause some challenges, especially for year-end reporting or Q1 reporting, and that, to plan as far in advance as possible.
Yeah, I would repeat that. And I would also mention that the early enforcement and regulatory relief that was provided by regulatory agencies early in the year, early in the pandemic, that's kind of gone by the wayside. And when you do have to access it, it's an after the fact request. And that's always a hard position to be in. So at least as you move forward into 2021, you really should try to plan and not be behind the 8 ball on compliance and not having to ask for forgiveness. And other than that, I want to thank everyone for their time.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. Thanks.
And thank you to Tiffin, John, and Pat for joining us today and sharing such valuable insight. For those listening in, we will send out a follow-up email with the recording here soon. If you have any additional questions or if anything comes up that you'd like to reach out, please feel free to reach out to the speakers or myself. Thank you to those who did provide feedback. If you haven't, we can leave that open for a little bit, but it looks like we got a good portion of folks to fill that survey poll out. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you to those listening in, and thank you again to our speakers. Have a good day.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.